Always an honor to have all of you here for a Brookings India, as I say, initiative, not an event, because what I believe is the purpose of these gatherings is to actually start a dialogue that might then lead to something more meaningful and concrete, tangible. Who knows? At some point, some government people might even take note of what we are saying. So it's really a question of bringing people together from various disciplines so that they can discuss issues of contemporary relevance to India, and obviously India in its domestic context, also its international context. Today, Brookings India is greatly privileged and honored to have three men who do not need introductions. I'll leave it to my colleague, Professor Sidhu, to decide whether he wants to say something about them. But ambassadors, there are three ambassadors: Ambassador Shyam Saran, who was our Foreign Secretary; Ambassador Husain Haqqani, who was the Pakistani ambassador to the United States; and Ambassador Mahbubani, who was Singapore's ambassador on 2 or 3 occasions to the United Nations, and is currently the professor at the Lee Kuan Yew University. Now, we have three extraordinary individuals who've written a lot, who've talked a lot about the South Asian dilemma in the global context, about India and South Asia and Southeast Asia. And this is really an occasion to engage them in a conversation, and then through that conversation to engage all of you in a conversation with them. So I have my colleague, W.P.S. Sidhu, who's also an expert on these issues, who's written just recently written a book on the emerging emerging balance of power, and I'm going to ask him to moderate this session. I'm going to request him to make sure that all of us, not just the three speakers, but all of us have an occasion to really speak. Contribute, and also, of course, express their views so that the others on the panel can perhaps respond to it. So once again, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for contributing to the initiative of Brookings India.
Distinguished panel and the speakers, but also to all of you for coming out on this particularly auspicious day. It has to be. There are 3 festivals falling on the same day. So thank you for being here with us. Before we start the proceedings, I just also wanted to flag, both for our panelists but also for all of you, that we now live in this interconnected and real-time world, and there's no better example of that than live tweeting. So this particular event and everything that the panelists and all of us say will be tweeted live. If anybody has an issue with that, speak now or forever be in tweetland. If there are no objections, let me start off by flagging a recent, really very thoughtful essay written by Margaret Macmillan, who's a historian of great repute, particularly on the First World War. The essay, which is titled The Rhyme of History, is actually posted on the Brookings website, and you can read it in great detail there. And what's very interesting in this essay is that she draws a parallel between the events running up to the First World War in 1914 and 2014. And she makes the argument that, we cannot assume that a global conflagration is unlikely. And there are certain trends which may make such a global conflagration and conflict quite possible in the coming years. And she presents 6 arguments for this particular perspective of hers. First, despite economic interdependence, this alone has never been a criteria to prevent war. It did not do so in the First World War, when Germany and the United Kingdom were the largest trading partners, and it may not do in the 21st century. Related to that, she also talks about some of, if you like, the underside of interdependence, and that is the rise of the middle class. And the aspirations of the middle class, particularly in the run-up to the First World War, was one of the key causes. And today that's one of the elements that we celebrate, but it's one of the things worth keeping in mind. Second is the rise of what she calls nativism and localism. And in some ways, the internet has actually perpetuated this even further, because people can go into much more narrower groups rather than actually broadening the horizons. Third is a critical role of the client or rentier states and their ability to instigate a conflict despite the best efforts of their patrons in trying to prevent these states from taking actions which may lead to a kind of a global conflagration. Fourth, there is also a complacency which has been brought on by the relatively long peace, certainly since the end of the Second World War. And there's a sense that this may lead on to people and states sleepwalking their way into war, unbeknownst to them in some ways. Fifth, there is also a delusion that deterrence, including nuclear deterrence alone, can prevent war. And again, it was this dependency, this expectation on deterrence, which in some ways also led to the First World War. Finally, and last but not the least, is the failure of leadership. And this we see not just at the national level, but also at the international level. Much has been written and talked about the relative decline of the United States. But at the same time, very few people are actually talking about the reluctance or inability of the others to try and lead in this moment of relative decline as well. But the most important thing, perhaps the most worrying thing in all of this trend, is that all of these conditions apply to South Asia. And this is precisely why we have this distinguished panel which is going to focus on what South Asia in general and India in particular could do to try and address that we go down one path which will lead to a particular outcome in 2014 rather than a path which takes us back to 1914. To start us off, and as Vikram said, this is very much going to be an interactive discussion. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani, who is also the inaugural Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. As Vikram mentioned, has served on the UN Security Council when Singapore was a member. He is at heart a multilateralist and an optimist, which is an interesting contradiction, but one which I think can only be explained because you like the songs of Mohammad Rafi. With that, Kishore, let me turn it over to you.
Let me begin by saying that, I'm not an eminent historian like Margaret Macmillan. But despite that, I'm going to say that what she's talking about is rubbish. And you can tweet it right away if you want to. Because there is a zeitgeist of pessimism in the West that doesn't understand how much the world has changed in the last 100 years. In 1914, if we had been sitting here, Vikram, 100,000 Englishmen were ruling 300 million Indians, including my ancestors, effortlessly. The Westerners were carving up China. There were settlements in Shanghai saying no dogs or Chinese allowed in the parks. That was the world of 1914. The world of 1914 was when, if you were a bright young student in Oxford or Cambridge, and the country said, let's go fight a merry war for Britain, the young men of 1914 would pick up the rifles and cross the channel and happily dive into the trenches and the best and brightest of UK and England were killed in 1914. That's a completely different world from the world we have today. A world where you had one or two small segments of humanity dominating the world. That world is gone. Okay, all the dormant Asian societies, which basically fell asleep for 200 years or so, have woken up. And having woken up, the stupidest thing they could do is to go to war today with each other. And if Margaret Macmillan was right, rising powers, we should be saying, hey, there could be a war between India and China. There could be a war within Japan and China. And if it happens, she'll be right. And if it doesn't happen, I'll be right. And I predict it will not happen. Because I can guarantee you that there'll be rising geopolitical rivalries. That's a given. And you see that between Japan and China most acutely today. And that will happen because there's a massive rebalancing that has to take place between Japan and China. Mm-hmm. For the last, I would say, most of the last 150 years, Japan was number one, China was number two. Now China is number one. Japan has tried to adjust to being number two and is having difficulties adjusting to it. And that's why there's tension there. This is normal. But this does not mean that a war is going to happen between Japan and China. So the critical thing for me that I emphasize is that this is actually from the point of view of the history of humanity, and this is the theme of the book that I brought out, which is what you're talking about, Vaiguru, about the optimism I speak about. These are the best of times ever in human history. And I'll give you 3 reasons why. One, the numbers of people actually dying in interstate wars is the lowest it has ever been since statistics were kept. In every front. Look at all the statistics. People dying from violence is going down. Secondly, the UN set the Millennium Development Goal of halving global poverty by 2015. Next year. They achieved that 3-4 years ago already. And we are on our verge of achieving total elimination of absolute poverty by 2030, according to the United States National Intelligence Council. And you will see this incredible explosion of middle classes all over the world, where you will see that the Asian middle classes, from West Asia to East Asia, which is roughly 500 million today, by 2020, is going to explode from 500 million to 1.75 billion. An increase of 3.5 times in less than a decade. Now, we have never, ever before in human history seen such advancement of the human condition as we are seeing now. So from a world of 1914, where a few capitals like London and Paris were deciding what was happening to the world, to a world where London and Paris are cities of the past and not cities of the future, is a completely different world. And this is why, please tweet it, Margaret Macmillan is talking rubbish.
I'm glad Margaret Macmillan provoked you enough to raise those key issues. Let me now turn it over to Ambassador Shyam Saran, who, as Vikram mentioned earlier, was not just the Foreign Secretary, but is now the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. He's also been described by his junior colleagues as one of the few foreign secretaries who believes in multilateralism, and I'd perhaps put you in the realist camp. So I don't know what music you listen to, but you're certainly very much welcome to present on this dimension.
Let me endorse to some extent what Ambassador Mahbubani has said. that in many ways this is really an age of optimism. This is an age where there is much to look forward to, certainly as far as Asian societies are concerned. And I would certainly like to include India in that category. I would also like to dispel the kind of notion which seems to underlie what Macmillan has said. That is, the only responsible countries are the Western countries. And somehow, if their ability to be ascendant powers is diminished, the others are not in a position or not willing to undertake global responsibilities. I think that is wrong for two reasons. One is there is every evidence that, in fact, the emerging countries are taking global responsibility. It is just this, that the manner in which they undertake their global responsibility is not always to the liking of the established powers. And therefore, they believe it's not responsible. I came across this again during the time we were doing climate change negotiations. The second thing is that whenever actually emerging powers try to take responsibility, this does not actually, it is not something that is very welcome to the established powers. The classic example is the effort made by Brazil and Turkey, for example, to try and mediate on the Iran nuclear crisis. As soon as it seemed as if it was succeeding, the carpet was, pulled under their feet. Or we find in numerous conversations we have had about maritime security that the US now says that it is no longer dependent upon the Gulf region for its oil supplies or energy supplies, but it has been providing maritime security to the region. And if the US withdraws, countries like India and China, who are so dependent and their dependence on the region is in fact increasing. What will they do? Are they ready to take responsibility? At one of these meetings, I said, well, would it be all right if Chinese Navy and the Indian Navy did actually work together to provide that security in the region? And that was not welcome to the US at all. They said, no, that is not what we want. So if that is the situation, then I think we have to rethink this whole aspect of global responsibility. So I would say that the emergence of the middle powers like China, India, Brazil, and others, I think it's a good thing. It, in fact, I believe, perhaps would be far more, much more of a factor in preventing another war from breaking out than, in fact, was the case in history, certainly in 1914. Let us look at some of the arguments you cited. For example, that economic interdependence or trade interdependence does not necessarily prevent war, perhaps. But I think if you look at the scale of interdependence today, compared to 1914, it's a completely different order of magnitude. So it's not exactly the same kind of equation that we are talking about. Secondly, it is also my view that if we take, say, China's emergence, because I think that seems to be the one factor which seems to worry many analysts, that the emergence of this new power, the fact that the existing power like the United States will want to resist this. This has been the historical experience. The fact is that it is not only a binary game. It is not like the binary game, for example, there was during the Cold War. Here, when we are talking about the emergence of China in Asia, don't forget that there are a number of other powers which are also emerging at the same time. It's not as if only the United States of America is there. There is Japan, which is still the third largest economy in the world. There is South Korea, which is becoming a major regional power. There is Southeast Asia, but in particular Indonesia. There is India. In other parts of the world, you have Brazil, you have South Africa. So if you're looking at the global landscape, what is really striking is that there are a number of countries which are emerging, and in Asia itself. even if China is seen to be going back to its level of preeminence in history, that history is no longer possible. Because that history belongs to an era where China's ascendant power was not really paralleled by any others in the Asian, certainly in the Asia Pacific region, who were of any kind of status compared to China's predominance. Today, that situation is completely different. So even in Asia, if there is a tendency on the part of China to assert itself unilaterally, you will see countervailing responses. In fact, you see that countervailing response already taking place. And I think that itself is something which should prevent an armed confrontation from developing. Of course, leadership is a key element. So if there is one element that I would agree upon with that analysis is the role of leadership. And perhaps if there is some element of pessimism I have, is that the quality of leadership that we see today in much of the world and even in our region is sorely lacking. Thank you.
Let me turn it over to Ambassador Husain Haqqani, who is also, and I should just flag this, written this book titled A Magnificent Delusion. It's largely on the US-Pakistan relationship, but I was very much struck by the parallel of this, and indeed, Kishore, your book's title, from a book from 1909, written by Norman Angell, titled The Grand Illusion, which again talked a little bit about, the run-up to, actually argued why war would not happen. But I think you have no such illusions, and you've been very clear about that.
Let me just begin by saying that, many years ago I heard the advice that a very senior lawyer gave to a young budding attorney. And he said, look, when the facts are on your side, argue the facts. When the law is on your side, argue the law. And when neither are on your side, confuse the judge. And from that, I extrapolate that when everybody is being an optimist, there's some merit in trying to be a pessimist, because at least it will bring some nuance to the discussion. Let's be very fair. Macmillan did not actually say what we are trying to put in her essay as a simplistic argument about 2014 will replicate 1914. That's not what she's saying. She's just saying that there is excessive over-exuberance in terms of optimism. There are assumptions that economic prosperity somehow prevents conflict. I would change the word war to conflict. That there are factors where nationalisms asserting themselves can sometimes lead to consequences that have not been thought through. That there can be non-state actors that can create circumstances that can lead to conflicts between states. Now, none of what Kishore has said is wrong. I mean, there is much about the contemporary world that we can all be excited about. We can all be very positive about many developments in the world. Yes, it is true that the colonial era is over. New nations have emerged. Some of those nations are doing very well. They have asserted themselves in the world. It's not the era in which only a few capitals mattered. But at the same time, the fact remains that North Korea is ruled by a young man who is, by all stretches of imagination and by all standards, emotionally, intellectually, and perhaps in every other way, very undependable and unpredictable. We have groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, and for that matter, Al-Qaeda, that are still alive, who basically do not think in terms of the 21st century, or even the Taliban. They think in terms of wanting to recreate the 8th or the 9th century in the 21st century. These are unpredictable actors. And when there are actors like that on the global stage, then everyone should just nuance their optimism. Don't give up on it, but nuance it a little bit. And instead of sort of saying, if Macmillan was saying definitely and was putting money on there will be war, then that would be a non-nuanced or not a very nuanced statement. But similarly, to say that any attempt to try and draw parallels with history, and parallels with history always depend as much on the similarities as they do on the dissimilarities. There are always dissimilarities in a parallel that also should matter. There are similarities. For example, a non-state actor, an individual kills the Archduke, that precipitates a series of events that actually brings about what was called the Great War. Could something like that happen again? Absolutely, and there is no harm in considering that possibility and being prepared for it. So that would be my take on the starting point of your discussion, without disagreeing with the substantive listing of all the positives. The second point I'd like to make is that as far as South Asia is concerned, South Asia is particularly unique in that this is one of the regions of the world where regional cooperation is really lagging behind. It's a region that is still bogged down with internal and intra-state politics with unresolved issues. I'm not saying that those need to be resolved before we can all move forward, but I am saying that that really does hold the region back. And talk about leadership, everybody talks about America's lack of leadership, which I think many people in America also now recognize, electing somebody with an insufficient experience of national leadership to the job of President of the United States has proven not to be a very smart idea. Experience does count in a job like that, because if your experience is only in community organization and maybe a limited exposure in the legislature, you don't necessarily think the kind of thoughts that you need to think in terms of being the head of the preeminent power of the world. Not necessarily the dominant power, but the preeminent power. But similar problems are occurring in other countries. The internal issues of leadership. Europe, by and large, is, yes, it's economically more integrated, but very frankly, it has totally abdicated any role in global security. Similarly, there are countries like Singapore, economically very important, but pray tell me, what would they do? I mean, asking the old famous question, how many divisions does the Pope have? So in this particular case, I could go, just as one can go for blessings to the Pope, one can go to Singapore for increasing one's bank balance. But I wonder, in a real security challenge that is posed by a resurgent Al-Qaeda or a network of terrorists, what would be the security role of some of these vibrant economies if they did not create, they can, but if they did not create a security component to their policies. And lastly, the leadership of individual nations. Let us be honest. Yes, this is becoming increasingly a multipolar world, but nobody can sort of punch enough weight individually or without some kind of bandwagoning to be able to provide the security leverage that the United States alone has. The United States has the security capability, the military capability that exceeds the military capability of all the, a large number of nations, I think 20 countries that come right after that. Under such circumstances, whatever grievances people might have with the United States, the fact remains that when it actually comes to finding a solution to stopping smaller actors from fighting each other, there is no alternative to turning to or talking to the United States. So maybe we need to find some middle ground between what has been said before me. And sitting in the middle, let me try and bring this conversation to a middle ground. I would like this conversation to focus a little bit on the potential for trouble created by non-state actors, potential for internal conflicts and political issues spilling over, the inability of any single major global power actually leading everybody else in one single direction, the ambitions of different countries colliding with each other, leading to, yes, it's a good way to describe it, that there will be sort of not necessarily more competition, but then competition can lead to conflict as well. And how do we preempt that? How do we stop that? And yes, multilateralism is all great, but multilateralism also has its limitations. I see no multilateral solution to, say, for example, North Korea's nuclear weapons program. I do not see a non-military solution to terrorist safe havens, wherever they are. States backing non-state actors, and then hiding behind the non-state actors being non-state actors when time for their accountability comes.
So 4 issues here, which I think, it'd be very good to sort of push you a little bit further on that. The first is the issue of leadership. I think all of you agree that in some ways that has been lacking, perhaps at the national level, but certainly at the global level. So how do you move in that general direction? Now, certainly the sort of established approach is to say reform all the existing mechanisms of global governance. But short of that, given the other politics involved in that, what are the other ways that one can likely sort of see leadership emerging in these various areas that we're talking about? Number one. Second, China. I think everybody agrees, and perhaps Husain was less eloquent about that. But Kishore, even you agree that there is going to be, as you described it, a geopolitical readjustment. How is that likely to happen without necessarily the conflict emerging? Are there mechanisms, are there ways that we can look at? And again, the point, Shyam, that you made about, China is not likely to go back to the image and really the kind of stand that it had way back 500 years ago. But do the Chinese know that? And do they buy that? And how does one engage and convince them otherwise? So that element, in some ways, it may be naive to say, how do you manage China, but how do you, in some ways, sort of bring China on board on this great convergence. The third is, and I think Husain made this point about, there are ungoverned spaces in the world. Kishore, you made this point in the book where, that war is unthinkable in Europe, precisely because of the kind of regional integration that's happened. ASEAN is perhaps, the other example of that in Asia. But what about, as Husain said, South Asia?
Or the Middle East.
Or the Middle East, again, within this region, or indeed Northeast Asia. What do you do in regions where there are very weak regional organizations or non-existent regional organizations? So with that, I hope I've provoked all of you enough to eke responses.
I'm actually very glad that Husain introduced nuance into Margaret Macmillan's argument. And I can completely agree that if you read an essay, it's probably very, very nuanced. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what the audience wants to listen from her essay. And, I'll give you a simple example. In 1990, when the Cold War ended, when Francis Fukuyama wrote his essay, The End of History, he wrote a very careful, nuanced essay. Did anyone read the essay? Most people didn't read it. But they only got the message that at the end of the Cold War, the West has triumphed, future belongs to liberal democracies, the rest of you better comply with the West. That was a very simple message that the West was happy to celebrate. It became a best-selling essay, a best-selling book. And that simplistic message, as Francis Fukuyama himself had conceded, has proven to be false. So it doesn't matter what the essay says. What matters is what people believe the essay to be saying. And all the stuff that I've read about Margaret Macmillan's essay seems to be saying she's warning us that 2014 will be like 1914. And that's why I say that belief is absolute rubbish, because 2014 will be nothing like 1914. There'll be no major wars. And if there are, I'm wrong. Take my word for it. Now you asked 3 questions: leadership, geopolitics, and unstable spots in the world. Now leadership, There's one key point I need to emphasize on leadership, which I say as a dean of a school of public policy. The era of heroic leaders is over. There'll be no more Mao Zedongs, Stalins, Lenins. That era is gone. Even in China, where there is no democracy, there's been the democratization of society, and leaders have to be much more responsive to the wishes of the people. So that era of heroic leaders, if you think it's going to come, will never come. But you will get more responsive leadership. And you know, for people who keep saying that, oh, there's no leadership in the West, it is conceivable, we don't know, maybe it's too early to tell, but it's conceivable that Xi Jinping may be the best leader that China has had after Deng Xiaoping. You say there's lack of leadership? How did China produce a great leader? How is he's having the courage to take on the vested interests and try to push through the reforms that neither Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao could do? There's some leadership there. But if you read the New York Times, or if you read the Western media, you get a completely distorted view on China, and that's the problem. The second one you mentioned is about geopolitical rivalries. And geopolitical rivalries will continue. They've been around for 2,000 years and will continue for 2,000 more years. But the question is, how do you adjust the relativities? And I can tell you, this is the point I was trying to make in the article that I made yesterday in the Indian Express on the Devyani Khobragade case. I can tell you that Washington, D.C. today has a completely different view of New Delhi. I serve in Washington, D.C. There was always a certain sign of pleasant condescension towards India. That era of pleasant condescension is over, because the United States now realizes you cannot push around India so easily. Even with a country with whom the United States has more common interests than opposing interests. And I can tell you that if they can handcuff Dominic Strauss-Kahn and get away with it, and cannot get away with a junior diplomat from India, they now know I got to take India more seriously than I take France. That's how the rebalancing happens. The relative weights of countries are adjusting every day, and it's on the basis of events that happen like this, and this will continue. But there'll be no wars. And finally, the trouble spots. And I completely agree with Husain that there remains Al-Qaeda. There remains the Middle East. There remains the problems in Pakistan. They are real. People are bombing each other. You can see that in the news every day. But is that the appropriate metaphor to describe 7 billion people in the world? You do a simple mathematical calculation of the number of countries and the populations that have to worry about explosions every day, like Middle East, like Afghanistan, like Pakistan. What is the total population? Add it up. Now add up the rest of the world. The rest of the world is having the best possible time it's ever had. I don't understand why the Middle East is taking a long time in catching up with the rest of the world. But at the end of the day, fortunately, when I go to places like Dubai, for example, you know, it is actually quite shocking that 20 years ago, Dubai was learning from Singapore. Today, in some areas, Dubai is ahead of Singapore. That's also the Middle East. So there are things happening, even in the most unpromising regions, that are positive. So don't just focus on the negative in the Middle East, look for the positive too.
It may be that the leadership that we are looking for may be different from the era of the great heroes, but you still need leaders, and maybe you need leaders like Xi Jinping, perhaps. But the importance of leadership is not to be underestimated. I would like to look at what I consider to be the uncertainties of the future from a different angle. And that angle is that if you look at virtually every part of the world, while we have this great prosperity sweeping across many parts of the world which were mired in poverty before, there is also no doubt that we are living in an age of ecological excess. Whether it is India, South Asia, or whether it is Europe, or whether you see what is happening in the Arctic or the Antarctica, the kind of resource, degradation, which in a sense underlies the kind of growth that has been taking place, which is really leading to the prosperity that we are celebrating. I am not very certain that unless there is leadership of the kind which can ensure ecological sustainability, that we will not end up, in fact, with a much greater crisis that is global in character, and where many of the conflicts that we are talking about, in fact, pale into insignificance because of this great emergency that we are facing. Now, there is a view that, science and technology has always been able to find a way out to these crises. I'm not so sure whether we are really in that era. Although some solutions are being found. But I think the key thing is, if I take the idiom from multilateralism, we all in multilateral fora, we all go to these fora with a very simple brief. And our brief is that, you go as a representative of your country, you give as little as possible, you try to extract as much as you can. I think that's the normal brief that all of us have, any one of us who has worked in multilateral fora. If you actually look at
the big secret away.
if you actually look at what that leads to, usually, it's a least common denominator result, which everyone knows is the realistic way of dealing with problems. But the issue today is that most of the problems that we face are cross-cutting in character, they are global in dimension, and therefore if you approach those issues with the same kind of a mindset, actually where maximal solutions are required, for example, if you are looking at terrorism, or if you are looking at non-proliferation, or you are looking at climate change, or you're looking at drug trafficking, you look at virtually every important crisis that we are facing today, which are global in character, then unless you change the mindset through which you approach these, you will not really make much headway. So take South Asia, for example. We have different conflicts, interstate conflicts in South Asia. We have the problem of terrorism. We have internal difficulties in many of our countries. But the biggest crisis actually facing South Asia is the ecological crisis. Where I think if you look at what's happening with the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas, if you look at what is happening with the degradation of the environment in our countries, the impact of this pretty soon will really overtake many of the conflicts that we are talking about. So that is where leadership is required. How do you, in a sense, articulate those challenges to your people and, in fact, be able to get some kind of a consensus how to deal with this? So this is where I think leadership becomes very important. And in South Asia particularly, all these issues that we are talking about have a certain kind of an acuteness which perhaps is not there in many other parts of the world. And this is where I think, whether it is to come from India or whether it is to come from some other South Asian country, I think unless we can get that kind of a leadership in this region, the future may be somewhat bleak, even though as I said earlier, there are causes for optimism as well.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the geopolitics, particularly vis-a-vis China?
Well, if we look at the India-China relationship, certainly
Largest
there
trading
is-
partners now.
there is no doubt that it is a competitive relationship. But at the same time, when we are looking at what I mentioned as global issues, take for example climate change, or if you take the adjustments to the global arrangements in different areas that Kishore mentioned, that there is a rebalancing going on at all the time. Now, in terms of the adjustment of existing global institutions, to make them more responsive to the aspirations, to the requirements of the emerging countries, the setting up of new global regimes in new areas like cyber, for example, or a new area such as how do you handle space. There are several new domains which have emerged where you don't actually have global regimes. It's quite anarchic. So whether it is in terms of adjustment of existing regimes, the trading regime or the investment regime, or whether it is in terms of the fashioning of new architecture in new domains, you will find that on many occasions, India and China find themselves on the same side of the fence. And that's a good thing. But there is also no doubt that there are areas where we do have, conflict. The border itself is one very good example, or what we see as an effort on the part of China to contain India by, for example, using Pakistan as a proxy power. So there are issues between the two countries, but I think there has been a fairly successful management, despite all the criticism that is leveled against India. I think there has been a fairly effective management of what could have been a much more fractious relationship between these two emerging powers.
I was about to say something slightly different. Because, we got off on the Macmillan essay, and then the discussion went. And our topic was supposed to be, how does South Asia feature?
Still is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is. Okay. So I was just going to say that the real challenge for all of us seems to be global order, as we understand it, was conceptualized under Western leadership over the last X number of years. And as Kishore and Ambassador Saran have pointed out, we are moving towards a point where there are multiple centers of power emerging globally. There are others asserting themselves. So will the institutions, the global institutions, be reformed to reflect that? Will it change to reflect that? Is something that we have to see as the trend of the future. Will that happen? Because I don't see that happening. That's why, for example, almost all international multilateral institutions continue to be structured in a way in which the West's leadership remains significant or important. And we all agree.
Yeah. Sorry.
We all agree on the decline of, for example, Europe's security capacity and America's general leadership capacity. And so how will that vacuum be filled? Who will rise to provide leadership in a new order? How will that old order be reformed to reflect the realities on ground of, say, for example, a much more rising China than it was when, say, the United Nations was conceptualized originally? What role India might want to play? And then, in terms of the regions, the two regions that we agree upon as having sort of not the same level of stability as the other regions, the Middle East and South Asia, we have to understand that one of the reasons is because these regions have had, they have much more unresolved issues than others. The Europeans have fought over their issues for centuries. In some cases, they've forgotten about them. In some cases, they've decided to ignore them. In some cases, they have actually found some solution or the other. In both the Middle East and in South Asia, the unresolved conflicts linger. And that is why I would personally feel that the need to nuance the optimism is far greater, especially when our topic is South Asia. And let me just come to very specific issues, why I would like more nuance in relation to South Asia. I do think that the internal developments of Pakistan and Afghanistan over the next few years will have relevance to the entire region. I think that the United States' withdrawal from Afghanistan without some kind of a alternative arrangement for the security of Afghanistan, who fills the vacuum, I think that will could lead to not necessarily a war, but it could lead to the kind of conflict and restlessness that we were talking about earlier. The jihadis could return to Afghanistan, or at least parts of Afghanistan, in a way in which they will have the kind of safe havens that resulted in 9/11. Something like that happening again in Europe or in America, then a lot will depend on how they react. For example, when the USS Cole was attacked, President Clinton's response was a few cruise missiles into Afghanistan without necessarily causing any harm except to a few trainees in a jihadi training camp. President Bush's response was a robust war, first in Afghanistan, then in Iraq, and then in Afghanistan again. So a lot will depend on how people react to the actions of different actors. And that is why I want to sit sort of, in the corner where I'm willing to say this is the scenario in the world and not pronounce clearly about everything's going to be wonderful when we come back and meet here again in December 2014. It's going to be a great year. And I'm not one of those who's going to say it's an absolutely disastrous year. There's just too many unresolved questions, unanswered questions, and unresolved issues. Mm-hmm. And this region in particular is really, really rife with unanswered questions. What happens in India's internal political dynamic? I mean, can you have a kind of a semi-governed India for a very long time and yet have some leadership in the region? Can you have a weak civilian government in Pakistan with the military continuing to assert control over strategic policy? Can you have a government in Afghanistan that will lose legitimacy once a new election is held, and if it does not result in an orderly transfer of power and the withdrawal of the Americans from there at the same time, and then the mess that is Bangladesh that we are witnessing? So in the presence of all that, will business continue as usual? Or will we have a unique situation in which there will be disorder and yet everybody will try to find order for their respective areas of life? Like, the bankers will try to sort of get banking in order, but bypassing the structure. The businessman will continue to do business even though the government is not necessarily strong and the governing frameworks are not strong.
Manmohan Singh. And in a presentation that he made to the heads of missions and the heads of the various Indian missions, he actually outlined what I think was the new Panchsheel, the 5 new principles that India needs to sort of follow. And one of them really goes to the heart of the discussion that we're having today, which is how does India play a more effective and greater role within its immediate region and its immediate neighborhood, and then how that can translate into a greater role at the global level. Let me end by thanking all of you for sharing so much of your knowledge, wisdom, insights, and not being afraid of having it tweeted. And also to everyone for coming and joining and partaking in this very lively interaction.